Hey, what's up? Welcome back to my channel. So as you know, I've mentioned on some previous videos, I've been dabbling in the world of writing comics in addition to drawing comics. For the longest time, I've just been working with writers and primarily handling all the art side of the comic making process. But as I get deeper into the process of making comics and spend more time doing it, I'm definitely more interested in the full scope of the medium and getting a better handle on telling a story through all aspects, including writing. So I've sort of been in this process of learning how to write in general. I've been reading some books about writing for movies and seeing if there's any overlap or trying to translate some of those techniques into writing for comics. In doing some of my research about how to write for comics, I've come across the Marvel method or the Marvel style of writing a script. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Marvel method or the Marvel style of writing and telling a story it's pretty much very plot driven rather than having a full script that the artist works off of. So in modern day comics, I would say anywhere from the mid to late 90s up until now, most mainstream comics are written in a full script kind of way. The artist works off of a full script that the writer has written, which details panel by panel what's going on and as well as what's being said in each panel. The script reads very much like a movie script or a script for television. That's the type of script that professionally I'm used to working off of. All the writers that I've worked with in comics have written in the full script style. I think there's a lot of really great benefits to working off of a full script for both the writer and the artist. The writer gets to fully imagine and realize the scene and communicate it very, very clearly and specifically, all the way down to what the characters are saying, as well as whatever the narration might be, even as to how many panels are on the page itself. So in that way, it leaves very little discrepancy for the artist. And when you're working on a deadline or a very long project, it takes some of that guesswork out for the artist. I found, though, at the same time, there still is space and room for myself, being the artist, to leave my mark on that page and on that story, even if it was very, very fully described by the writer. As an artist, I still do take liberties where I might blend two panels together, or I might pace out a scene to make it slightly longer and add a couple panels if I feel necessary. So even though I'm working off of a full script, I still don't feel restricted in terms of creativity or inserting my own stylistic choices. The difference between a full script and the Marvel style or the Marvel method is that the Marvel method, which was employed by Stan Lee when he would collaborate with artists like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, the way they would do it back then was that the writer and the artist would talk about what that issue is going to be about, what's going to happen, what are the key points, what some of the drama might be, what some of the subtext might be, what some of the action scenes might be, the characters that are in it, essentially just broadly telling the story of what happens in that issue. From there, the artist would then pace it out visually. They'll just lay out the whole issue based on what he and the writer discussed. The artist will then meet back up with the writer. The writer then reacts to the art that the artist brought back, and on top of that will create dialogue and narration and sort of play off the visual information that they're getting. So in this way, it's a lot more of a collaborative effort. Within this approach, the artist has quite a bit of creative control and overall storytelling power. Now, that version is probably the broadest example of the Marvel method. A step above that, which perhaps was used more often, was that the writer would write out the plot of the story for that issue and break it down page by page. So for instance, a plot might look like page 1, Spider-Man walks into a building and sees Mary Jane. Page 2, Mary Jane then jumps out the window. Page 3, splash page, Spider-Man catches Mary Jane, something like that. So rather than saying page 1, panel 1, establishing shot, page 2, you see Spider-Man walking up the stairs, rather than breaking it down frame by frame, the writer is just broadly saying what is happening on each page. From there, then the artist will pace out that particular page, determining how many panels are going to be on the page and figuring out how they're going to build up that action that will then lead into the next page. So I recently was reading this great article online. I'll link it down below. But it was pretty much describing this whole process, and it was showing examples of the type of plot that Stan Lee would give to Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko, for instance. And it's really, really broadly, very loosely written. For instance, the first issue of Fantastic Four was written on one piece of paper, and he just kind of summarized the characters, how the origin is going to be explained, a little bit of the motivation of each character. It was much more like a pitch rather than anything close to a script. You have to assume that the artist, in this case Jack Kirby with Fantastic Four, did a hell of a lot of the legwork in terms of really creating a lot of what we know of that particular origin story. It seems as though with this technique, especially the way it was employed back then, the writer was trying to get as much out of the artist as possible by giving them these really exciting, imaginative ideas to play with and giving them the space and the room to draw it out in a way that best serves them and their style. And then the artist is then giving back to the writer something super exciting and visually interesting that then they can react off of by adding interesting, clever dialogue and narration. So in a way, it's almost very much like a band creating music. Each member of the band is reacting off of what the other is putting down. In a way, it's almost like jazz or improv as well. And what came out of that process was a very lively, energetic, and highly entertaining piece of storytelling. It seems as though less people employ this type of technique when writing and collaborating now. I think what it might be, and the article that I'll link down below actually touches on this a little bit, is that nowadays the way comics are made, it requires a lot of trust between the writer and the artist and the entire creative team. So many of the mainstream companies are owned by very big corporations, and in order to put out product consistently and sustain some sort of quality control, they're much less willing to use a technique that very much relies on improvisational skills and intangible aspects. Oftentimes nowadays, I can certainly attest to this, most creative teams never met. Everything is done through email. Oftentimes, parts of the creative team don't even live in the same country. So in that way, it's kind of awesome that we could all collaborate without having to be in the same space or even within the same country. But I think it's a lot harder to employ something like the Marvel style when you don't have that close relationship or at least even physical proximity. For instance, like a writer and an artist being in the same room or meeting up at a cafe just to talk about the story before anyone puts any words or images down on the paper, just to kind of go back and forth and brainstorm and spark each other's imaginations before marks are actually put down. You know, that's a luxury that a lot of us don't have nowadays in the process of making at least mainstream comics. And to try and do this process solely through email back and forth, it would probably actually take longer than the way we do it nowadays. But as someone now who is trying to write for themselves more and more and get better at writing and get better at illustrating the things that I write, I feel as though I could almost take advantage of this Marvel style, this Marvel method myself, in the way that I could almost react to my own art. So similarly to the way that I'll ink my own pencils, for instance, there's very little point in me creating very finished, very detailed pencils if I'm the one who's going to be inking it. I sort of know where I want to go with it. I know my inking style. I understand my own shorthand when it comes to penciling. So therefore, my pencils are there as a guide. They're there to lay the framework down, and they're there for my inks to react off of. So as far as writing for myself, it's kind of the same approach. I almost feel like it's slightly a waste of time and inefficient to write a full script when I'm the one who's going to be illustrating it. The script, in many ways, the full script, is there for the writer to communicate their vision to the artist in as clear and detailed a way as possible, so there's very little discrepancy. I remember watching an interview with Matt Wagner where he was explaining how he writes. Even though he was talking about how he writes for another artist, he actually does thumbnail little boxes, and instead of sketching what's happening in pictures within those boxes, he actually just writes what's happening on each page. And then from there, he kind of writes a more outline plot that he then gives to the artist. And then the artwork comes back and he does more of the detailed, dialogue and narration and all that. So in many ways, it's very much like a Marvel method. It seems like there are still a few writers that work in this method, Chris Claremont being one of them, Mark Waid being another, and Matt Fraction. And this article points out that Matt Fraction and David Aja work this way on their Hawkeye run. And if anyone's familiar with that particular version of Hawkeye, it's a very unique, different take on the character, but the storytelling is really, really well done. Both the writer and the artist created a very interesting pacing and really strong character development. When I was reading it, I didn't know that it was created in this way, so it's very interesting to find out later on that that's actually how it was created. Because when you look at some of those pages and you read the comic, it's hard to imagine how Matt Fraction would have written out all of that in words in a full script. So much of it is reliant on the visual storytelling and the pacing and the framing set up by David Aja. So I think that's like a much more modern day example of how this sort of Marvel method can be used to create something really cool. So anyway, if you're interested in writing comics, if you already write comics, if you're an artist who wants to write your own stuff, maybe this is a technique to check out and read more about and perhaps try out on your own. I'll link that article down below. There's a couple of other articles and podcasts that I listened to that had to do with this topic, so I'll try to link those down below as well. If you know of any artist-writer duos that work this way, leave a comment down below. I'd love to do some more research into the type of comics that were made in this fashion, especially more modern day since it's used less often nowadays. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.